Hey everyone, this is Brian Barczyk from BHB Reptiles and Snake Bites TV. You're listening to the Herp Herpere Show.
It says here we should work in teams. I tend to think of myself as a one-man wolf pack.
You're about to enter Information Overload, a worldwide transmission with Herp Herpere's featured Breeder of the Week. Here's your host, Jason Rossi.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening in on this episode of Herp Herpere. I'm your guest host, Sean Bradley from Exotics by Nature, filling in for Jason Rossi. You can all listen to this episode by way of iTunes, Stitcher Radio, RossiReptiles.com, or the brand new HerpHerpere.com. That's complete with forums and information on not only on this podcast, but as well as on many things reptile related. This episode is the third and final part of a three-part series wherein I will be answering various questions from you guys, the listeners, that you messaged me over the last few weeks. In the first episode, I interviewed my understudy, Tim Bailey, of Bailey & Bailey Reptiles. If you haven't listened to that one, I suggest you listen to it because Tim has a lot to share with newcomers to the hobby, to the business, especially the business on the small side of things, smaller side, having it as a second job, an additional sort of income, or even just a simple hobby that's turned into something that can make money or at least break even. I mean, who's ever had a hobby that broke even? I mean, this is the only one that I could think of. So also in the second episode, I interviewed the person who influenced me and my career the most, and that was Brian Barczyk of BHB Enterprises. Give that one a listen for sure because we covered a lot of ground with the background of him as an old-school breeder as well as his thoughts on the future of the ball python trade, where it's going, and what especially what role the mass merchandisers like Petco, PetSmart, et cetera, places like that have to offer, not just disadvantages to us all, since, you know, we all have to have a starting point in the business, and a lot of times it's our local pet stores or even those big mass merchants that kind of start us all off. So give that a shout, give that a listen. I mean, you know, I really, and give Brian a shout too with, you know, your feedback on how that went. So for those of you guys who are listening in and don't know much about me, I'm the owner of Exotics by Nature, which I started when I was 20 years old. It's now 13 years later, and we're still going strong, and we've changed around a bit on what we've done. Over the years, I've kept and bred a lot of species of reptiles and even some amphibians as well. We ran our own reptile specialty retail pet store down here in Louisiana, which lasted about 9 years before it just became too much work for me amongst breeding and internet business and spending time with my family, too. It takes a lot of time, but, you know, it's not like I needed to confirm my credentials with you guys, but answering these questions that you've given me, I feel I've had the experience over the years to really give you some insight on what I think the business is doing, what I think about husbandry techniques, breeding, things like that. So I guess without further delay, let me get on to the questions. I'm gonna mention the names of the people who asked these questions, and I'm hoping that none of these are redundant in a way, but I'm gonna do my best to answer them. First of all, Dane Chason asked me a while ago the pros and cons of a few different things, and one of them was buying baby snakes versus adults. And I guess when we're looking into ball pythons specifically, a lot of times my feelings are that when you purchase adult animals, you're getting something that came from someone else's collection, someone else's means of care and breeding, feeding, cleaning schedules, things like that. I mean, for instance, I for one don't like to feed after I clean because, I find that the ball python gets upset, in a new clean cage. Its smells aren't as prevalent, where it defecated, where it shed. None of that stuff's there anymore. So I find that if you feed after you clean cages, that your animals actually will feed and do better if you do it the other way around, because you're not upsetting them. So, I guess for lack of a better term, feed a dirty cage, because that animal's comfortable in its environment that it's basically made for itself. So, when we have that issue, and let's say I ship you an adult, your care and husbandry techniques are going to be different. So a lot of times I find especially with ball pythons that are over 600 to 700, maybe 800 grams, shipping them to a new place can be really problematic. I mean, a lot of times I do really well with them, but, it seems like when we send stuff off that's larger, people have a lot more issues with feeding response and things like that being affected. So I guess my advice for buying babies versus adults is try to buy younger stuff because it's not only, something you can trust. In other words, I guess if you're dealing with someone selling a larger animal, you have to question how old it is, was it fed properly, is its growth stunted, and then when you come into full-grown adults, particularly females, how many times has it laid eggs? How old is it? If it's even an animal that does well in captivity and lays eggs regularly or is ready to breed, its follicular development is advanced or whatnot. So I personally like to buy babies. I don't ever really sell adult animals unless we're talking about male breeders because we need to replace our male breeders regularly just because, we're advancing in new mutations. But as far as females, we spend so much time and money raising them up that I'm not really sure, that selling them is ever a good idea financially, much less, a good idea for the snake itself because if it's been raised here all of its life and I'm sending it to an entirely new environment and new regimen of care, then, that's kind of difficult for me. So I say pros and cons, that's it, of buying babies versus adults. In the boa constrictor world, buying adults can be rather upsetting to the animal as well. So it's not really a feeding thing so much as it is just a general, where it lives, husbandry and care. I find that taking on boa constrictors and ball pythons at a younger age to be, more advantageous. So, all right, moving on, live, fresh, killed or frozen food. Dane also was asking about that. I say on ball pythons live all the way for me just because it's easier, it's more cost efficient, even though they are more expensive. If in a collection of 400 or 500 ball pythons, if I thought out, 200, 300 rats, and I'm using hemostats and I'm going in a cage and shaking it in front of them or whatever, trying to entice them to eat, then I'm spending a lot of time doing that with that many snakes. So for me, live with ball pythons really is the way to go. We can drop them in a cage. We buy a smaller, percentage of what we need. If I'm feeding 400 female ball pythons, I might only order 250 to 300 rats just because of regular food refusal. Maybe I'll order more than that, but what I end up doing is we drop the food on one section. We let it sit in the cages for, 30 minutes to an hour, no longer than an hour. And then we go back, we pick them up if they're fed, if they fed, people keep records of feeding, mark your feedings down, move on to the next cage, and pull out all those live rats that are uneaten and move on to the next section. That's how I do it personally. As far as fresh killed, It's always, or frozen, it's always safer for the animal. In some respects, some people will view it more humane for the rodent. You're going to be, euthanized, fresh killed or frozen food, gassing it, or whatever form of humane euthanasia that you're using for your food, or your supplier is using for the food you purchase from them. You're gonna look at that being more humane for the rodent and safer for the snake itself. So we're feeding boa constrictors, colubrids, things like that. We feed frozen because they take the food every time. It's fast to offer them on hemostats. It's not something where you have to sit there and try to entice the animal to feed on it. So for ball pythons, I go live. A lot of people are doing frozen, and it's possible. It takes a lot of time. So on your smaller collections, it's cheaper to buy frozen food. Again, we touched on the humane aspects of frozen food. Or fresh killed or frozen. So that's my advice there. It's really one of those things where I like fresh killed and frozen for everything but ball pythons, just because of the time it takes and the animals and their finickiness. So moving on to another one of Dane's questions was maternal versus artificial incubation. Maternal incubation is something that I've rarely done. I've done it for the experience. I did it with Burmese pythons and a couple of times, and also I did it with a reticulated python once, just because I thought it was interesting to see it happen the way it happens in the wild. Totally go artificial incubation. It's easy to build an incubator. All it takes is some heat tape, a small fan, and a thermostat in a large insulated container. A lot of people get old refrigerators. That works really well. You get yourself a nice, double-sided glass front refrigerator out of an old throwaway from a convenience store that's broken. Take the compressor out, or if the compressor's already removed, basically just put a fan in there. The simplest thing is those AC-operated computer fans. A lot of times you can get them from aquarium supply companies because they use them for lighting. You can go to Radio Shack or someplace like that and pick them up. Put a couple of these computer fans in this giant refrigerator or whatever you can find, and just make it to where the air circulates completely all the way around. String yourself some heat tape. That tends to be the safest method of heating. Throughout the box of the refrigerator or whatever, just string some around, or get some of the big heat tape and put it on the back or the sides. You want to be sure you don't have any hot spots. So, contact somebody that sells a good infrared thermometer that you can use to shoot different spots of the incubator, and be sure you have a nice, even, steady temperature. And then you're putting your eggs inside of a box that's completely airtight and sealed, okay, because you don't want to have any infiltration of insects, like if you have fruit flies in your snake building, just because it's hard to get away from or fecal flies. It's hard to get away from those with, a lot of snakes, and especially in a warmer climate, the southern U.S. You don't want those flies in there messing with your eggs, because if you have any eggs with weak spots or whatever, then that could be a problem. So go ahead and do that, airtight, sealed box. Some people use incubation medium like Hatchright or whatever that's already mixed with water. I'm going to tell you really quick the simplest recipe for incubation medium is what I use is I go to a feed store, I get a coarse grade vermiculite and get a coarse grade perlite, and I mix it 2-to-1, so 2 parts vermiculite to 1 part perlite. And you need to use a respirator mask, like one used for painting or dust control. The dust from these 2 items is harmful. It's not something you want to breathe in. It'll make you cough a lot. It's also really bad for you. So you want to be sure you're wearing a mask when you mix this up, okay? And then take some water, all right? Now, you can't do water by volume or weight because, we're in different climates. The vermiculite that I'm buying here locally in Louisiana is so moist and humid here that vermiculite is picking up water moisture from the air. versus someone who lives in, let's say, Arizona or, out in the desert somewhere. If they go to their local store and buy vermiculite, even though it's probably in a fairly sealed bag, if the bag has any sort of holes in it at all, this material is going to absorb moisture. So if we weighed a bag of vermiculite from a desert region versus from down here in the south where it's really humid, those bags would weigh significantly different amounts. So I can't tell you a volume or weight because your medium is going to have a certain moisture content to it. So what we need to do is we need to put 2 parts vermiculite, 1 part perlite, however much you need to do, all right, and then take a very small amount of water. Usually for me, I'm using about 5, I use a 16-ounce deli cup. I use about 5 of those of vermiculite, right, and then about 2.5 roughly of perlite. And then I probably only use like a full one of those containers of water, and that's enough for me here. But put enough water in, thoroughly mix it to where, you can pick it up and squeeze it in your fist. Squeeze it as tight as humanly possible. I mean, the absolute, tightest you can possibly squeeze it to where no water is bleeding through your knuckle cracks, okay? So in your fist, you don't want any water coming out of your knuckles. But when you release that fist, that clump stays together. It stays together in a form to where you can use your finger and tap it lightly and tap it about 2 or 3 times before it falls apart. This is where a video podcast would really come in handy, so I could actually show you this. But I'm sure there's plenty of other things. Brian with snake bites has probably done this on his show more than once. We'll look this up and see it. But picking that medium up and squeezing it as tight as you can. No water's coming through your knuckles where you're releasing it. You have a clump sitting there. You tap it a couple times with your finger lightly, and it falls apart. That is very ideal for incubating almost every species of egg-laying snake that we work with. So that's what I do here. It's what I've done for geckos. I've done it for bearded dragons, ball pythons, colubrids of all types. It works really well for me. So put that inside of your sealed box and put that inside of this heated incubator that we're discussing earlier, and there you go. That's incubation. I mean, you don't need to buy something fancy. It doesn't need to be, some chest that's made with these shelves and, slide-out drawers or whatever. If you have the money to invest in something that's commercially available, by all means, go ahead and do it. But, if you listen to my earlier show with Tim, we really encourage you to start off with building your own racks, building your own incubators. It's really a way to save a lot of money, and it's more money to spend on snakes for your collection. It's more money to put into your business so that you can grow and you're not wasting it. So, if you want to know how I do it, I have a heated room that's an incubation room. My room is pretty sizable. It's about 8 by 12 feet with a standard 8-foot ceiling. It's got an insulated walk-in door. I went ahead and put a little fancy door on it with a full glass pane in it because I wanted to be able to just look in there and be sure that everything was kosher, was cool. So, that's what I did. I have one of those floor heaters. It's a sealed oil-filled heater. You can buy them at Walmart. They're available with multi-wattage switches. A lot of times they're 1,500 watts. They usually have a 600-watt switch and a 900-watt switch, and you can activate them both. I usually run at about the mid-range at about the 900-watt setting. I plug that into a large thermostat at the table to handle the wattage. I happen to have a few of the older Helix controls that are 1,500 watts each. So that's what I do. I hang the probe in the room off of one of the shelves, and the room is lined with closet organizer shelving around all sides, and I can fit it pretty much a godly amount of eggs. I mean, I've never even come close to filling this room with eggs. It just so happened to be the room size that I ended up with when I built my building. It's what I ended up with left over. So, and that's it. I run a fan. I run 2 fans on the ceiling, one in the left corner in the front, one in the back right corner facing down, so that my room has a complete circulation. So we keep that room at about 87.5 degrees is where I like it. It works for me with the pythons and stuff. Colubrids, you want it to be a little lower, as well as lizards. A lot of people have different temperatures. You'd have to look into those temperatures exactly. But yeah, okay. Boas, need not say, maternal incubation is all you get. You know, you want to be sure to offer your boas a heat gradient. One side of the cage be nice and warm. The other side of the cage be, you know, your regular room temperature for your reptile room would be. And that way mom can go back and forth and regulate her temperature. And because she's growing those babies inside, she needs to have a hot spot. She needs to be able to come off of it. So, you know, I do highly recommend belly heat on female snakes that you're breeding, okay? You can use back heat. You can use room heat to raise your animals. It's not a problem with their digestion if you do it at the right temperatures. But please try to use belly heat on those girls because they do use it. Ball pythons and boas will sit on that when they're developing their eggs. They need that heat to warm their body up to do well. So that brings us on to the next and last part of Dane's questions. He actually asked a nice multi-layered question there about cutting versus the natural hatching of eggs. Personally, I cut eggs. I always have. I try not to do it irresponsibly. In other words, I'm not one of these guys that's going to cut a window in his ball python egg at day 45 so that I can see what I got early. I have done this, admittedly. It has most of the time worked out fine for me. I have honestly experienced loss with this method of cutting early. I don't recommend it. With ball pythons, I leave my eggs in a clutch. I leave them in a pile. When I get them out, I don't peel them apart. I put them in the incubation boxes in one big pile, however they come out. And I find that right in the end stage, when you get a lot of moisture developing on the lid of the incubation box, if you can go in and easily pull those eggs apart, then that's time to cut if you want to cut. If the eggs just literally fall apart, you can pull them, you know, you'd have to use all the force in the world early in the stages of incubation to pull these eggs apart. You'd probably rip the eggs trying to remove them from the stack. But when this stage comes up, you can pull them apart with ease, okay? They literally just fall apart. So, you know, that, if you're going to cut, I don't know what day that is, you know, because the day in incubation varies on your temperature. It'll be sooner if you're incubating higher. It'll be later if you're incubating lower. You know, it's just like cooking in an oven. You know, anything you cook at a higher temperature is going to cook faster. So, you know, for me, I'm not even sure what day that is anymore that I can cut these eggs. But when I do cut them at that stage, they're typically out of the eggs within the next 3 to 4 days at the latest. So it doesn't seem to be a problem. Naturally hatching them is always awesome to watch. It's always cool to see those snakes with their egg tooth slit that egg open and come right out. And almost every time with ball pythons, that's the way it's going to be. But in all my years of experiencing colubrids hatching, I've had my fill of, you know, snakes dying in the eggs or not being able to cut their way out. So, you know, with colubrids and stuff, once one of them pips or two of them pip out and have their heads out, I'll go ahead and cut the rest of the eggs if they've been incubated evenly and all this stuff. So, you know, that's how I deal with cutting versus natural hatching. A lot of times I will have clutches every year that naturally hatch because I just don't get around to doing them in time or whatever. But we never let an egg, you know, in a clutch that's got snakes hatching actively. We never let an egg that's uncut go without being cut, just because that snake could break its egg tooth off. It could be born with one that's not, you know, properly formed, whatever reason it could be. So that's that. Thanks a lot, Dane, for asking those questions. Those were really good husbandry questions. Now, kind of the last husbandry question that I'm going to touch on real quick is this one from Tim Bailey and Tracy Olivo asked me the same thing, to touch on respiratory infections and treatments. I personally am not a veterinarian. I do not like to give medical advice to people because I'm not qualified to give you that advice. So it's really hard for me to answer that question. But I would like to touch on one quick thing. if you have a respiratory infected animal, bring that animal to a veterinarian that can test it properly, okay? Bring that animal to a university with a veterinary program. Don't just grab Baytril or Fortaz or whatever off the shelf and treat it like you'd treat anything. And the reason for this is that, every one of these, viruses, bacterias, whatever the cause may be, they're affected by an antibiotic in a different way. A long list of antibiotics that veterinarians and stuff will prescribe for usage. Now, the responsible thing to do is to have the animal tested so that they can actually take a culture, they can test the different antibiotics on whatever the problem is and see which ones work and which ones don't. Okay, if you have time to do this, as far as if the animal's not too far gone, because this, process isn't instant, it takes a little time, do this. Because, first of all, you need to target the problem at the root of the problem. So you need to use a medication that works, whether it be gram-negative, gram-positive, or multi, however it affects the problem. That's what they're going to prescribe to you. Now, the second problem with this, or, I guess the main problem, but the second thing to mention, is that when an animal has a problem, a health problem like this, if you treat it with a medication, like let's say Baytril doesn't kill the problem. If you treat the animal with Baytril, the animal's body will develop a resistance to Baytril. So the next time the animal's sick, if Baytril would normally work on whatever the cause is, it may not work because you treated the animal with it blindly and ineffectively. So, we've experienced a few times, veterinary friends of mine that we've worked on some research projects in the past, because I'm in the direct vicinity of LSU, which Louisiana State University, which has one of the leading veterinary programs in the country. I've heard from my vet friends there that they've worked on alligators at some of the alligator farms where the farmers were just treating with, antibiotics, like, oh, these things are sick, I'm just going to treat them with this stuff. And what ended up happening was the animals ended up being resistant to almost every type of treatment that there was, so that when they would get sick, there was no way to treat them. So that's really my biggest thing with that is, even though it's expensive, seek out veterinary care. Don't try to be your own vet if you don't have the ability to test for these things and stuff like that. So, go ahead and be responsible and do that. And again, if you can bring it, if there's a university vet program near you, bring it there. They usually have more advanced techniques. They're usually very interested in working on exotics, reptiles, birds, fish, things like that, because people just don't bring them in. So it's a good learning experience for their students, and you will get some pretty advanced care at most of these places. So, okay, well, I'm going to move on to some business stuff, get out of this husbandry talk, since I'm sure that there's, an umpteen million shows, that you've listened to that they're out there about husbandry, and everybody, does things differently. So on to this. Smith asked me, how did you know that spending tens of thousands of dollars on ball pythons back in the day was going to pay off for your future? Well, Adam, if I knew that it was going to pay off, I would be far, far, far rich, because I would know so many things about, the future. I would be, exponentially wealthy, and I would probably have upset the natural progression of history, having known what's going to be the best. I had a good feeling, and this was based on years in the pet business of working with pets in the stores, seeing what people buy. People buy corn snakes, they buy ball pythons, they buy boa constrictors, they buy leopard geckos, bearded dragons, crested geckos now. There's a few, new trends out there. Like, we can talk about carpets and blood pythons and retics and Burmese and stuff all we want. And there are some amazing mutations. And there are some very successful breeders that make a lot of money breeding those species. But the thing is that they're not a mainstream species. They're not one that a lot of people buy and, keep regularly. People want multiple reptiles. In my experience, like I said, I owned Exotics by Nature, owned a retail store here locally in Covington, Louisiana, for 9, almost 10 years. And previous to that, I worked in pet shops since I was 13 years old. So we're talking, now 20 years in the retail pet experience. I've found that people like to own multiple things. You can sell someone an aquarium or a reptile cage for their corn snake or ball python or whatever, and when that animal outgrows that cage and they move to a bigger cage, they buy another reptile to put in that smaller cage. I mean, that's, and you eventually have your regular everyday customers that don't breed anything, that have a reptile room in their house. They have, 10 lizards and 15 snakes. They're coming in the store, they're buying rodents and crickets and everything else all at the same time, and it's like a full order. And eventually they either continue to keep their hobby, which a lot of people end up doing, or they move into breeding snakes to try to make, or breeding their pets to try to make some of that money back, or just do it for the experience of doing it. So, back to the question, spending tens of thousands of dollars on ball pythons. I remember as a kid, and Brian and I touched on this a little bit. I went to the first Orlando show in like 1994, I think. I was 14 years old, maybe 95. I was 15, something like that. It was somewhere around there. I remember I think I had just got my learner's permit to drive. And my cousin Mark and I went down to Orlando to the show. We had always heard amazing things about this giant mecca of reptiles in Orlando, Florida. We read about it on in some magazines. There was no internet reptile business back then. I went I think it was 1995. I went to this show, and I'm walking around, and we have speckled king snakes here, native in Louisiana, and I was familiar with snakes, but I had not seen the amount that was in Orlando. I mean, this show was so packed. I wish you guys could experience it back then. It was so packed full of people. It was hot, even though the convention space would have their air conditioners going full steam. It was shoulder-to-shoulder people. You could barely move down the aisles. And, every table was just packed with, all kinds of stuff, mountain king snakes, all kinds of geckos, iguanas, Burmese pythons, boas, all this stuff, but it didn't have the morphs that it has now, and there was nowhere near the ball python, breeders. I mean, if you saw a ball python there, it was something that was imported, or it was something that a breeder was selling at, a normal. There was no morphs really, even though it hadn't really started and gotten kicked off yet. So I'm walking around, and I mentioned the speckled king snake because I pick up this deli cup. And, I'm holding it in my hand, and I'm pretty sure it says $10 on the deli cup. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, man, this is a really cool-looking little snake. This is a neat-looking speckled king snake. My cousin grabs the cup from me, puts it back on the table, and just, swats me, punches me right in the arm, and says, don't pick up anything anymore. That's a diamond python. And that thing says, $10,000 or whatever on it. It doesn't say $10 on it. You don't need to be picking up stuff like that. And I was like, wow, it really are snakes that are this expensive. I was blown away by that. Later on that day, I walked by a table. It had just these amazing colored boas and this ridiculous-looking ball python. And the guy's name was Peter Call. And he had these albino boa constrictors. And, man, it was beyond me that I've worked in a pet shop, and I've seen many red-tailed boas or Colombian, common boas, BCIs, and this albino BCI was just intense. I mean, it was amazing looking, and this was this guy named Peter Call, and there's this guy who walks up, and he speaks German, and he's got a really thick German accent. He takes out $150,000 in cash. And he buys these albino boas. He buys a whole pile of them. He walks away with just a stack of deli cups filled with these albino boas. And Pete Calls just tucks his $150,000 behind his table and goes on about his business. And he's showing people this amazing-looking ball python that's got white splotches all over it. You know, he's calling it a piebald. And you know, asking the price, I was just curious, and I asked him, and he said, you know, these things are going to be $25,000 to $30,000 when I sell them, maybe in a year or two. And sure enough, Pieds, the first time I saw him open up with a price, there was $40,000 for a pair, $25,000 for a male, and $15,000 for a female. And then in another table to show, there was a guy named Bob Clark that had albino ball pythons, and I thought, man, this albino ball python is crazy. I thought they'd be $2,000, $3,000 because, geez, it's just a ball python, you know. He wanted $10,000, I think $9,500 for these things. And I thought, you know, if there's this kind of money in this, maybe my hobby can turn into something more. So, you know, going home, I left that show with a handful of gray-banded king snakes. At that show, I met Brian and Lori Barchak, you know, which has turned into a great friendship after almost 20 years. And I went home with these colubrids, like gray bands, and I think a few mountain king snakes. I think I had Mexicana greeri, which was a mountain king snake that was really hard to find. I went home with those snakes, and I aspired to breed them and have a future, or at least a hobby that paid for itself. And, you know, in the early 2000s, I was blessed with the ability to be able to make some investments. And at that time, we spent, you know, a few $100,000 picking up some stuff, you know, pieds, albinos, hypos, pastels, clowns, super pastels. All of these things were very expensive. You know, the first spider we bought in 2003 was $18,000. The first pinstripe we bought in 2003 was $25,000. The first pod was $15,000. And I knew that I would make it because I saw other people making it. I saw Brian Barchak, Bob Clark, Peter Call. You know, there's a bunch of people back then, and I mean, I was getting into it at the same time as a lot of these other guys. You know, Mike Wilbanks and Ralph Davis. You know, a few other people that were really getting heavily into breeding these high-end snakes. And I knew that if there was more people out there like me, that it wouldn't be a problem because I didn't need to sell that much stuff to really make it back. You know, I didn't, you know, you'd sell 2-3 snakes and make the money back that you invested, and that's an amazing accomplishment. So that was it, and that was how I knew back then that spending tens of thousands of dollars on ball pythons would make it, because there was other people making it, and why couldn't I do what they did? So on to this next one. Reese Huddleston asked me this a while back when I first announced that I was going to do these shows, and he's really targeting the young audience with these questions. But I think this, not only does it appeal to, you know, he mentioned 18 to 25-year-olds, but it appeals to all of us, not just the young crowd. But I'll address it as a young crowd, because when I was spending my initial investment, I remember I was doing it at the same time as Corey Woods, and Corey and I were the same age. I mean, we're both 33, and we were investing in this stuff at the same time period, and we were spending a lot of money. You know, I heard about this other 21-year-old kid from Canada that was blowing a lot of cash, and I thought, hey, man, at least he's smart enough to realize that there is a future in this thing. So Reese asked me, for young people, 18 to 25, who want to invest in ball pythons, is it plausible to make the investment, or will it become a bunch of wasted money? And, you know, I kind of, you know, got some redundancy here with Adam's question. You know, it wasn't going to be a waste of money, because I didn't think the economy would collapse for this. You know, I mean, when it comes to this stuff, it seems like people have a different level of spending, a different motivation for buying things. I mean, people enjoy this stuff, like Brian and I touched on the last show. You know, you have to buy stuff that you like. You have to do things that you love. You can't just do this and say, I'm going to go breed snakes and make money, because it won't work for you. You won't have any passion. You won't have any drive, and people will see that. People will see through you and say, oh, this guy's just doing this shit for money, and that's just not okay. It's not really something that you're going to succeed with. So, is it a plausible investment, Reese? Yes, it is. It is a plausible investment because I'm doing it, and 100 other people are doing it. And this marketplace is enormous. I mean, between what we're selling here in the U.S., what we're exporting to Europe and Asia, it's absolutely ridiculous what the need is for making those investments. And you have to invest in the market, too, to make it work. I mean, you can't I think that's going to be any investment business model. A lot of people say that old adage, you got to spend money to make money. And then there's those people that think, well, you got to make money to spend money, and the thing is you got to put it out there, and you have to put work into your collection. The investment is more of a time investment and an investment of your passion and your interests, more so than it is just, spending money. It's not, I'm going to buy this snake for $10,000 and I'm going to put it in a rack and I'm going to breed it and make this much money. That has nothing to do with it. It's the time you take to feed it. It's the time you take to breed it, hatch its babies, put love into those babies to get them to a decent saleable size, put love into the photography that you have to use to put it on your website or on Facebook or, wherever, kingsnake.com, wherever you're trying to really, get your stuff out there. That's where your investment is. The money investment is I think, a very small part of what we're dealing with here. So, and that brings us to your second question, Reese, is, what's a good way to build up a reputation in the hobby for young people? Again, he says, 18 to 20, 18 to 25, but this appeals to everyone, not just young people. Make a website. Even if it's just a page with some pictures of your snakes with your story on it, put yourself out there with it. Again, you can't just buy the animals and hope that that's going to turn into a huge income for you. So, basically you have to sell yourself, in a way. I don't mean prostitution here. Or maybe I do in some ways of the way some people like to sell their stuff, It doesn't mean that. It means you need to get your presence known. I mean, I want to know who Reese Huddleston is, who's asking these questions. Now, obviously, Reese, I know you. We're friends on Facebook. We've talked. We've messaged each other before and everything. I'm familiar with you. But I want to know what you're all about. I mean, I want to know what your reptile business is, if there's a name to it. I want to know, we touched on this before, and I'm gonna get to it in a couple minutes here. I want to know that you're a real business. I want to know that you've got something to lose if you sell me something that's not good. I want to know that there's some reliability and accountability with you and your business. I think that once you make the investment of buying the animals, once you've made the investment of buying the rack systems and stuff, let's talk about that for a second. The investment of buying racks and having incubators and having food available. This stuff is all costly, and it's something you will succeed making back, and you will succeed making profit on. But it's going to be about you and the time you put into it. So I want to know that there's time there. I want to know that if you're raising your own rodents, I want to know this. I don't mind seeing pictures of your place. I've had pictures of my place on the website before. I intend to do it again. Of course, I'm always in a state where I feel like I'm unsettled and I'm not ready to take pictures yet because I'm always putting in new cages or adding on another room or, doing something like that. I want to know what's up with you. I want to know your, where, I guess basically where you're from. I wouldn't mind even reading a little page about how you got into this whole thing, whether you got into it at a pet store or you were just reading something online one day, whatever your story may be. I want to know if your wife, your girlfriend, and your kids are involved. That all is important to me. I'd like to see some nice animals, too. I'd like to see some nice photographs. A lot of people are taking cell phone pictures and putting them up in ads, and I just don't think that that's representing yourself very well. Building up a good reputation is being known and being trusted. After all the years that I've been doing this, I'm thankful for my reputation, because you could tell me that my investments went down in value all you want. You can say, oh, your pinstripe for $25,000 is now worth $200. That's all fine and good. And you can buy what I spent probably over 5 years in the early 2000s, what I probably spent $500,000 building. You could probably go out and buy for less than $20,000 now, maybe even $10,000 you could go buy it. But you can't buy the 13 years of me and having satisfied customers. You can't buy that. You can't. I mean, I've shipped out thousands and thousands of packages. You can't put a price on that reputation that I've gotten from being there and being steady. I never screwed anybody over. I never intentionally sold something that wasn't what I said it was. Everybody makes mistakes, and over the years there's been accidents here and there, but everybody's satisfied. That customer that needs to be the most important thing to you, and that's on any level in this business. That's whether you spend $100 or $100,000. With us here at EBN, you will get the same purchasing experience regardless of the amount of money you spend. And it'll be a good experience, It won't be, oh, man, I bought a snake from that guy for $10,000, and he treated me like crap. And then I bought a $100 snake from him, and he treated me like crap. It's not like that at all. We treat you with the utmost respect regardless of the amount of your purchase. And it's because your customers deserve that. They're buying an animal from you that they're going to have for many years. And if it's going to breed for them, they're going to want to make their investment back the same way you did, And that's where the business comes in play, is getting a good reputation is not only promoting yourself, but it's promoting this industry. It's promoting the hobby. Go to reptile shows, talk to people. I'll tell you personally, when I set up a table at a show, I have $20 normals on the table. I might have a $20,000, coral glow banana, whatever, on the table too, and everything in between. But the important part to me is that $20 normal, because that's where people come in. That customer is the customer that you're going to educate about snakes. You're going to educate about husbandry, and then next year you might educate them about breeding. And the year after that, you might be selling them copious amounts of snakes for their collection to grow. And even if you're not, you'll be answering questions for them about how to breed snakes, how to feed them, how to hatch those eggs, how to mix that vermiculite. Every little bit of that. How when I had a store, I used to have people come by, and I'd show them how to mix vermiculite. I had a tub of vermiculite sitting nearby to where I could just grab it and say, hey, come over here by the sink. Let me run some water here, and let me show you how to mix this. Let me get your hands in it and show you just how squeezing that stuff, the squeeze test works, And I can't tell you how many eggs have hatched from people that I taught that to. And that not only does it feel good to do it, to help people out, but it helps grow the industry. Okay? So reputation, Reese, is about time and hard work and dedication and education to people that are listening to you and looking to you for advice, because there will always be a novice in all of us, regardless of how much we know. There will always be something that my customers or my friends that breed snakes will tell me that I didn't know before. It happens every time, every year. I don't have an instance in mind to mention, but it's out there, So that's a really good question, or two questions, Reese. Is it a plausible investment? Absolutely. And how do you build reputation? Just build it. Just get it done. Put yourself out there where people know who you are and what you're all about. And, remember what we talked about on the Bar Shack show. Every single dollar spent in this industry goes to you. Okay? If you think that way, you will absolutely succeed. Every dollar that I make is part of your dollar, because every customer that I introduce with those $20 ball pythons at a show is going to come around to your table one day and look at your snakes. And at that point in time, if you've done all that you can do to appeal to that customer, to have nice-looking animals that are healthy, to be responsible with how you handle your clients, how you help them out, that person's going to buy from you. If they don't buy from you, they're going to buy from your buddy down the street who you got into snakes too. And when he gets that money from them, he's going to come to your table and he's going to buy from you. If you think that way, you will absolutely make it. So thank you, Reese, for that. And then the last question that I was asked, recently, and it was kind of interesting because it's kind of a broad one, but I can focus on it pretty quickly. Tim Johnson asked me, if you could keep any reptile that you haven't already owned, what would it be? Well, I'll tell you what, I had a room in my old shop. It was like a 10 by 12 room, and I had cages on one wall that I built that were super nice and fancy, and then I had racks on the other wall. And this room was basically Sean's personal zoo. I had green tree pythons, diamonds, angolans, black-headed pythons, womas, rhino rat snakes, bamboo rat snakes, strange king snakes still, like mountain kings, Arizona mountain kings, huachucas, Chihuahuan mountain kings, things like that. All of these things that were, they didn't really have much of a place in the market of the morphs, ball python morphs, boa morphs. I had, I don't even know, at the old store, I had a pretty big room full of ball pythons, and then I had another like 500 or 600 square foot area full of boas. And it was really compartmentalized. I had this, everything had its own space. But that one room, to me, was fun to go in because it had all the snakes that I dreamed of having when I was young. Reading the book from Ross and Marzek, The Reproductive Husbandry of Pythons and Boas, which if you can get a copy, it's a fantastic book. Reading that book and seeing these snakes that had very little breeding data on them and actually being able to own those animals was a pleasure to me. But, to answer Tim's question, I would like, if I could have my way, I would like to work with some species that were, were threatened, like some of the iguana species, the rock iguanas and things that are threatened in the wild. And very rare in captivity. I'd like to breed something like that to where I feel that I'm back in the game of contributing more to ecology. I'd like to work with some different geckos again, some knobtail geckos and stuff, some of the rarer things. Snake-wise, I've kept so many different things over the years. I don't really have one snake that I would say, I would love to keep this, But yeah, I think if I could do anything that I haven't done, I would like to do that. I'd like to do, Lewisii iguanas or something crazy, something that I can, sailfin lizards. I don't know. That stuff really interests me a lot. So, the final thing I wanted to say before we sign off, because, we're almost out of time here, is please legitimize yourself. Tim and I touched on this, and by legitimizing yourself, I mean if you have a business and you're going to shows and selling things, get a business. Put together an LLC. Put together an S-Corp. Put together just a simple sole proprietorship business that you file on your regular income taxes. Being a legitimate business gives you voice. It gives you the ability to say, I have something to lose if it's threatened. We're going through some tumultuous times with lawmakers lately, with snakes. A lot of the gun owners out there know, what they're going through, particularly right now with impending legislation. And to be heard isn't going to be, hey, I go sell my snakes at a flea market on the weekends when I'm bored and need money. That's not going to have a voice. A voice is going to be, I set up at the largest shows in the country. I am Exotics by Nature company that is an incorporated legal business. I have tax returns to show you how much money I make or how much money I could potentially lose by your legislation, by your new law you want to pass that tells me that I can't do what I love. That's really important. I can't stress it enough. You'll be taken seriously. The next thing that I can't stress enough, and the last thing, is join up with an organization that has your best interest in mind. Okay, USARK, PJAC, your local herp society is a great place to start, where you can get down to the grassroots of what's important. It's not about money so much as it is about voice. You have to have that voice with these organizations to be able to say, hey, I am a reptile keeper, I'm a snake keeper, and I want to fight for my right to keep that snake. I want to fight for my right to, when I have children, that grow up, that they can have the same stuff that I have. And that's, in an American basic right. And, we don't have to get into all of that. But I really want you guys to participate strongly in organizations and organize yourself. Everybody needs to band together. There's not a lot of these organizations out there, but lately there's been some, contention between a couple of them. And honestly, everybody just needs to stop doing the who's better and he did this and whatever crap and just band together and get it done together. And that will be, we've already formed this into somewhat of an industry. So that will be the most important thing for our future, having this ability to run this business, to have this industry prosper, is going to be the professional organization of us all. We all have our little names where we call ourselves this and that on forums and whatever, but make that name mean something, It's back to that same question from Reese about reputation. Make it mean something. Okay, so I guess I've gone on for a while now, solo. I've really enjoyed this. I really thank you guys for listening. Again, this is the end of the 3-part series that I've done with Tim Bailey on the first one, Brian Barczak on the second one, and me running solo on the third, to try to give you guys some insight to what we successful people are doing. And we're going to continue to work hard to keep our companies growing. And I'm going to continue, I know, to work hard to educate people, to try to influence you guys to do more with yourself, with your businesses. So it's been a lot of fun hosting. I really want to thank Jason Rossi for giving up the show to me for a few episodes for me to do this. I brainstormed on this in a really short. It just came to me in a vision,